Hi, it's Trent again from Speak2Read. I'm back. I wanted to talk to you about the two-part blog series I posted. I made a video alluding to part one, which I posted in late June to my blog, which is Understanding Dyslexia, and I provided the definition from the International Dyslexia Association. And in this part two, I put the blog up early July, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about just unpacking that definition and some of the problems that we encounter in practice. And so one of the first things that we see, I was thinking maybe I could even just read the definition to you just so that you are really clear on what it is we're talking about. And dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin, and it is characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent reading, word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. And these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So in looking at that, some of the things that come up is that the difficulty is unexpected, and people often say like, oh, my kid speaks fine, or they don't have any speech errors, we don't need a speech therapist, or they have no problems following directions, their language is fine. And the language difficulties that show up in reading, writing, and spelling are often specific to those tasks. Sometimes a child will have difficulty just in spelling, but it is still a language-based deficit that's impacting their spelling, and it's impacting their whole access to the world of literacy. So it's an unexpected difficulty. Usually these children are very bright, they're good critical thinkers, they're good at making sense of things, they can follow directions. So we don't see a lot of red flags in other areas of learning. They may be good at math, often are very good athletes, very talented with music. So it's an unexpected difficulty. When we see children with a lower cognitive profile, we often will expect there'll be some difficulties in learning to read, write, and spell. These children that have dyslexia, we don't anticipate these things to be as hard as they are, and all of a sudden, for some reason, they're not reading or writing or spelling or comprehending as well as we think they should. The next point that I wanted to make is that these are secondary problems. And I talk about this on my blog, but reading comprehension, very often when people come to me and say that their kids read fine, they just don't comprehend what they read, when we really go in and dig around and unpack, they're not reading as well as we think. Again, that dyslexia said that, the definition said that dyslexia is a difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition, and quite often there is a breakdown in that when children are reading, they're not recognizing those words efficiently, not quickly enough, so that they're not seeing the word and pulling out the meaning and moving on. They're spending some time processing there to figure out what the word is, and that processing is slowing down and bogging the system, and it's interrupting the fluency and it's interrupting the comprehension. Very often, that's what I see. And when there's difficulties with reading comprehension, especially when people say it's only reading comprehension, I always need to go in and have a look and just see what is there for those prerequisite speech, sound, and language meaning foundational skills, to make sure that they actually have got this code cracked for which letters represent which sounds and letter patterns. So it's just something to be aware of, that reading comprehension is a secondary problem, and almost always there's something in that reading system that needs to be addressed. And if not, then we look a little bit deeper, and usually we can find something around vocabulary and semantic association, or maybe social comprehension, that is impacting comprehension if they truly are reading at a level that we expect them to given their age. So it's a secondary problem, and it's something that is also very important to go in and have a look at. I also just think it's interesting to note that dyslexia is trouble with recognizing and reading words, and that's it. I talked a lot about this in the first video and in the first blog post, but people have a misconception of what dyslexia is, and what it is basically difficulty recognizing words. So when you see words and you don't immediately recognize them and process them and pull out the meaning, you're exhibiting the characteristics and hallmarks of dyslexia. And I think that when we look at the International Dyslexia Association's website, one of the statistics that they post is that 32% of children are not reading at grade level by grade 4. And we have, I think, a bit of a stigma around dyslexia where we don't want to call it that. But what if there's actually, instead of the 5 or 10% of kids that get diagnosed with dyslexia, what if it's actually about 25 or 30% of kids that do have dyslexia, that they have difficulty recognizing and processing words, and it's about a third of kids that have trouble with that. If a third of kids were getting diagnosed with this, would there be a stigma around it? Maybe not. It would be a fairly common thing. As well, if 30% of kids were getting diagnosed with dyslexia, would we change our practices for how we address it? You know, the International Dyslexia Association has very clear practice standards and guidelines about how to teach these type of children that have a different learning brain and a learning difference. But those practices don't make it into our schools and our classrooms very often. If 30% of kids benefit from this instruction and 30% of kids have that diagnosis, what would that change? So I just think it's really interesting to go and look at what is the definition and see how many kids does that definition actually fit? Because I guarantee you it's a lot higher than the 5 or 10% who actually get diagnosed. And quite often kids don't get a diagnosis of dyslexia anymore. They get a more general classification of a reading disability or a learning disability, which doesn't point as specifically to dyslexia, which of course is bad or difficult reading, which is what dyslexia means. The next thing that I wanted to talk about in that definition is that dyslexia is diagnosed after effective instruction has been provided. So this is really challenging because if a child hasn't been exposed to literacy and hasn't been exposed to effective literacy instruction, we can't say that they have a learning disability or they have dyslexia because they just simply haven't been taught to read. If a child has been taught and they still haven't learned, well, now we can say there's a problem. But that brings up a whole host of issues in that gap or that span to say, well, what have they been taught? Who has taught it? What did the instruction look like? How much did they get? Should we have expected them to learn? And what this ends up doing is it puts us into this kind of wait and see position where we often find these children in kindergarten or grade 1 that don't have the prerequisite skills that we would expect. They're not picking up, maybe they're late with their speech, or they don't speak clearly, or they're not picking up their sound awareness. They can't look at letters and tell you what the letters are. They can't tell you what the sounds are. They're not acquiring sight words. So we have a concern early in grade 1. We don't do anything with that. We don't diagnose until they've had a couple of years of effective instruction to see if they're going to learn. And then after a couple of years in grade 3, grade 4, we say, nope, they haven't learned, so now let's diagnose them. But by then, they're behind. They're behind in the race. They're late. They're late to the party. And it's just kind of an inefficient system because we could put some of these practice standards, these guidelines in place as soon as we recognize that there's a problem. And maybe we could do a little bit more to prevent some of these things from becoming as much of a problem as they are. And as well, we talk about effective instruction, but quite often what we're giving kids in schools isn't effective. I mean, when we know what the practice guidelines would recommend, if we're not putting that in place, how can we say that we're giving them effective instruction? So even though we kind of wait and see, and then by grade 3 or 4 we say, okay, they're not reading and all the other kids are, they haven't learned from effective instruction, we don't have very effective instructional practices in that when kids don't read well in grade 1, we don't have a lot of things that we do to really adapt their instruction. And I talk about this at length in my blog, and I really encourage you to read it because in schools we often use packaged programs like Lively Letters or Jolly Phonics or Leveled Literacy Intervention, and these boxed programs, these packages, are good tools for exposing children with typical developing brains to the literacy foundations that they need. And when children have a learning difference, as we know from the practice guidelines, they need a special type of instruction, and those programs don't deliver it, and we often don't have people in schools who can deliver it. So how can we say that we're giving effective instruction? And if we don't give effective instruction, then how can we diagnose and say, well, then this is dyslexia because we gave good instruction, they didn't learn from it? So this is where there's a little bit of a conundrum around the diagnosis and why often the diagnosis is not provided until, grade 3 or grade 4 at the earliest. And it's much more frequent that the diagnosis of a learning disability shows up in grade 5 or grade 8 or high school, and even there's a lot of people that get diagnosed in college or university. It's very common, and it's sad that it takes that long and it happens that late. So that's another issue that I wanted to write about on my blog, and I encourage you to go and check it out. And last and not least is just if you have concerns, if any of this is fitting, like if your child is behind in reading, if they're not at grade level, if they have trouble sounding out words, if they have trouble recognizing whole words, trouble acquiring sight words, difficulties with fluency, difficulties reading out loud and having intonation or expression in there. These are all signs that there's something that's not quite, their brain is not quite designed to easily acquire literacy skills. And there are things that we can certainly do to go in and have the brain actually shift and change. Neurological changes in the brain happen with effective speech, language, and literacy instruction. It's one of the things we get really excited about, is we actually change children's brains, and it doesn't take as long as you might think. And it's certainly going to be very, very valuable for your child's whole developmental career, all the way through school, into their career, into their adult life. It's going to be a lifelong gift that you can give your child. So I encourage you to take advantage of the free consultation, to come in and talk about what's going on with your child. You'll learn some things about how children learn to read. I'm sure there'll be a lot of education for you as well as some answers. And I really do look forward to meeting with you, meeting new children, new students, new families. I'm really all about the connections that we get to make here. Pretty excited about the therapies that we're providing as well. And just really want to get this message out. I do feel like this blog post, of all the things I've written, is just the most important message, just to raise some awareness about what is dyslexia and what isn't dyslexia and what can be done about it. So part 1 and part 2 are on my blog at speak2read.ca. Please have a look. Please share it to other people. These videos are lengthy. They're informative. If you got all the way through it, I commend you. I acknowledge you for that, and I thank you for your generosity and your time. And I do look forward to providing some more of this education for parents and for educators out there. Thank you. Bye-bye.